So the collection of the McMichael is pretty big, as you can tell. And what you see in the gallery behind us is just a really small sample of that work. Sarah Milroy, just before COVID struck, began to glean what she considered to be the most important pieces, the most representative. When the Albuquerque Museum talks about coast to coast to coast, it literally is a collection that spans the entire nations of Canada, right from the Arctic Ocean to the Pacific and across to the Atlantic. Today, I've chosen 11 works. It's a really small selection, but I thought that it was best to maybe whittle it down a little bit so that we could talk maybe at more depth about where this work comes from. Who are the people who made it? Are they still alive? Are they still with us? What are the motivations that are driving some of this work, or that drove some of this historical work from the past? So that's what it's going to be today, a bit of a journey. I'm going to start with the oldest piece that in this collection of 11 works. And I'm going to operate the little screen here. Okay. This is a tiny, tiny little piece, and it would be possible, I think, to walk by it and not remark on it at all, because it's 2 inches by 2.5 inches. It's a little silver bracelet. But this is probably one of the most valuable pieces in the McMichael's collection, not because it's silver, but because it's by an artist by the name of Charles Eden Shaw. I'm going to get, so excuse me, but I might get choked up sometimes. And it's because for Canadians, and especially for Indigenous Canadians, some of these names are, they're icons to us. He was a carrier of the traditions, and he brought the traditions through a needle hole, the eye of a needle. Charles Eden Shaw's Haida, so that is from the west coast of Canada, Haida Gwaii. He was born in 1838. He died in 1924. The piece is called Wasco Bracelet, and it was made in around 1910. So what it shows is a image of a wolf. It's called Wasco, and Wasco is a mythological figure who is half wolf and half killer whale. And what Eden Shaw said in making this piece was that this was his clan. He derived his clan from his mother. The Haida are matrilineal, meaning that the name and the clan come through your mother. In 1884, when Eden Shaw was maybe 40 years old, the Canadian government instituted a law. It's called the potlatch ban. And the potlatch ban said that Native people could not perform their dances. They could not perform their ceremonial gatherings. They could not hold the feasting, ceremonial, theatrical performances and feasts that used to occur, that were really the spine or the support of the Indigenous community along the northwest coast of North America. Because what would happen is people, strong families, a strong family would commission artists, would commission cooks, would commission hunters or fishermen, would commission theatrical performers, makers of ceremonial masks, makers of ceremonial cloaks. They would commission all of these tradespeople to produce abundance of works and food, and they would throw a big party called a potlatch. And the potlatch would last for several days, and at the end of this large celebration, the family who had thrown the party would give everything away. Well, when the first missionaries arrived, and later the Indian agents arrived in BC and saw this incredible profligacy, how can they be giving it away? And like, it seemed ungodly to them. And it's not to say it seemed completely uneconomically feasible and not in line with the way that the British and the Spanish wanted things to be done. So they banned the potlatch. If you look deeper into why they would ban something like that, it's economics, of course. They didn't like this idea that the Haida and the other people along the West Coast had an independent and self-sufficient, self-renewing economy. Because the way the potlatch work was, you gave everything away, but 2 years later, another family would throw a similar party, and for 2 years, everyone in those communities would be employed and paid, making the goods for the next potlatch. And this was how, number one, the economy was restored, but number two, the traditions that underlied the making of these goods was taught. They had a guild system, and they would teach young people how to do these things, how to make these things. Well, this was all taken away by the Canadian government. And as I said, Eden Shaw was just a young man when that happened. He was a silversmith. He was a carver. He carved totem poles. He was a mask maker. All of a sudden, none of that was allowed. So what did he do? He began making tiny little things like this. And he began encoding them with the story of his people, because he knew that this was the only way that he was going to allow this thing that was so precious to him, that was his gift. It was the only way that he could ensure its survival. It's a kind of a history book in miniature. It's a precious, precious thing to us. I'm so glad that it's here, but when I see it, it makes me weep. Charles Eden Shaw. This next piece is by Dempsey Bob. Dempsey Bob is a Tatlan Tlingit Indigenous person from northern BC, also on the coast of the Pacific Ocean. He was born in Telegraph Creek in BC in 1948. He's still with us. This piece is called Wolves in Snow Blanket. It was made in 1999, we think, because it's interesting in that Dempsey made the little wooden wolf clasp at the top, but the blanket is made by his sister, Linda Bob. And we think that Linda took a little bit longer to make the blanket. So the dates on this piece, 1999 to 2002. Dempsey Bob is a carver in wood. He makes masks and totem poles. He makes bowls. He's renowned in Canada as well. He's a holder of the Order of Canada, which is the highest civilian honor that can be given to a Canadian citizen. He's also a holder of a Governor General's Award in visual art, which is the highest honor that can be given to an artist in Canada. He has both of those. He again is noticing and remarking on the matrilineal traditions of his people. That's why it's so important that his sister Linda Bob is implicated in this work. It's a button blanket. Some of you may know of the button blankets from the Northwest Coast. It's this red trade cloth appliqued with blue and then decorated with abalone buttons. They're extremely important ceremonial cloaks. They were worn in the potlatch. Now that potlatch law that I told you about was introduced by the Canadian government in 1884. Finally, in 1951, it was repealed. It was repealed on the insistence of the United Nations, who decided that this was a complete trampling of human rights. And so the Canadian government finally repealed that law. And what we see after 1951, when the potlatch law was repealed, is a flowering of Indigenous art and culture in Canada. I don't know if you have a similar history here in the States, but for us, that moment, 1951, marks an incredible watershed in our history as Indigenous artists and people, because it allowed us finally to bring out our stories and bring out our history and talk about, in a visual way or in a ceremonial way, those things that are most important to us. Dempsey Bob is an instructor. He was a founder of a school of carving. So this is how important this was to him and to the people of the Northwest Coast. Embedded in their tradition is this notion of teaching. So he was a co-founder of the Frida Dicing School of Contemporary Northwest Coast Carving. He still teaches there. It is in honor of a woman carver. And so again, we see this thread through of the importance of women's work and the importance of women's influence on the culture, particularly on the Northwest Coast.
And one thing I'd like to add about this blanket as well, and the clasp, is that the provenance of this work is interesting is because this was featured in a solo show of Dempsey Bob Wolves, that was put on by the McMichael, and it's currently touring, so we're very lucky to have this piece here. And before we move on to sort of the next region, I guess, of artists, while we're still talking about Northwest Coast, one thing, not to go back all the way to Charles Edenshaw, but he's also an argillite carver, and I think as we're talking about Indigenous people and self-determining and getting the opportunity to tell our own stories, Charles Edenshaw was also a carver of argillite, and there is some argillite on display in the exhibition if you have a chance to go see before or after this show. And those are interesting works because only Haida people have the rights to carve that material. It's a very fine, dark sort of shale. So. Yeah,
and about those little poles, they're miniatures again. Yeah. So once again, he was sneakily encoding his history and the tradition of carving into small things that would escape the notice of the Indian agent and the RCMP, who were actively confiscating works from communities during that time. Yeah, thank you. Our next slide is another iconic artist in Canadian art history, and particularly Canadian Indigenous art history, but I would say that Norval Morrisseau has crossed over into the annals of Canadian contemporary art history, regardless of whether he's Indigenous or not. And he was really the first artist to do this in Canada. So Norval Morrisseau was born in Beardmore, Ontario. That's in the northwest part of the province of Ontario. He was a Anishinaabe painter, Ojibwa. His name, his assumed name as an adult was Copper Thunderbird, and he began to sign his work as Copper Thunderbird. This piece was made in 1975. It's acrylic on hardboard, and it's of Self-Portrait. Morrisseau is such an interesting character, and we could all of the artists that we've talked about so far, we could do a whole 2-hour lecture just on them. Morrisseau, though, stands out because he was such a media darling. He burst on the scene in the 1960s. He started painting in the 1950s. When the potlatch law was repealed, he began to paint. He didn't have any instruction. He had been raised by his grandparents, his parents. He had spent some time in a residential school. I think you call them boarding schools here, an Indian boarding school. But he got sick, so he was sort of saved from the worst ravages of the boarding school experience, and he was raised largely by his grandfather. His grandfather taught him the history, the stories, the legends, the medicines, the magic of the Anishinaabe people. And when Morrisseau began to paint, it became apparent to everyone in the neighborhood. He was painting on cardboard for a while. He was painting on boards. He was painting on the side of the house. He didn't have any materials. But people noticed his work, and one of the local doctors in the community noticed him and began showing him books of French painters, art books from Europe. And Morrisseau was like a human sponge. He soaked it up. This is what brilliance is, eh? This is what genius is when you see someone who just soaks it up and began to incorporate notions of how do you design a two-dimensional plane, how do you incorporate drawing. He started looking at different materials. He began painting on canvas in acrylic paints. He was noticed by art dealers in Toronto, and his work was brought down to the center of the city of Toronto. Probably one of the most racist cities in Canada. But the day that his show opened on Yonge Street, it sold out that afternoon. And the next day, his work was featured in the Globe and Mail newspaper in Toronto. And the art world in Canada embraced him. And he embraced the art world, too. He was a showman. He was a spokesman. He was a storyteller. He also called himself a shaman. It's an old tradition in the Anishinaabe people that we are the key carriers of the medicines, the carriers of the stories, the legends. And Norval absolutely epitomized that. His style, I think, is important to talk about because his style influenced artists and continues to influence artists to this day. We lost Norval in 2005, I think. 2007, I'm sorry. He was born in 1932 and died in 2007. But his work continues to resonate and continues to influence both young and older artists of Anishinaabe extraction. It's called the Woodland School, and it's typified by these flat planes of color, so pure color, often right out of the tube, and then form lines, black form lines that define each plane. And when you see those black form lines, you're going to recognize, of course, that this is Woodland School painting. It's so interesting, however, when you think again about Eden Shaw and the drawing on that little tiny bracelet. We're seeing a similar kind of iconography, that form line. It's very, very interesting. And one of the really valuable things about having a show like this and being able to travel it down here and talk to Indigenous artists down here is to pick out those similarities, those through lines that still connect us. What more to say about Norval Morrisseau? So much, so much. He believed that the colors were medicine. He believed that the colors had power. He believed that he had power, and if you ever saw him speak or were in his presence, you could feel that. He considered himself to be bringing back the spirit of his people, and he did us proud. Yeah. You want to say?
And in terms of the McMichael as well, Norval Morrisseau had an ongoing relationship with the McMichaels and with the museum. And so we were, I say that like I was physically present, but Norval Morrisseau was in residence and producing works for some time while he was staying on the property that is now the McMichael Canadian Art Collection, which makes it a really significant and really important place for scholars of Norval Morrisseau's work to come and visit. But yeah, super important man, and one of the founding members of was called the Professional Native Indian Artist Inc., or as we call it colloquially, the Indigenous Group of Seven. We just talked about the Group of Seven of Canadian landscape painters, and then there was also sort of an Indigenous Group of Seven of very, very influential painters at that time.
Yeah. Thank you. The next artist I want to talk about is Carl Beam. Carl Beam is also Ojibwa Anishinaabe, also from Ontario, but from a different region of Ontario. He's from Manitoulin Island, which is in central Ontario, just a little bit south of where I'm from. Carl Beam was born in Chiging First Nation on Manitoulin Island in 1943. He died in 2005 at the age of 62. This piece is called Various Concerns of the Artist. So of the four artists that we've looked at so far, Carl was the first one to attend a English or a Anglo or a settler university. He went to the Kootenai School of Art. He went to the University of Victoria, and he also went for a short time to the University of Alberta. So this is a very different trajectory. We suddenly see someone who has been intimately exposed to the notions of drawing, painting, and printmaking from a European perspective. He was educated first, though, at Garnier Residential School on the north shore of Lake Huron. He was taken there at the age of 10 in a boat from Manitoulin Island and dropped off at Garnier Residential School, and he stayed there until he was 18 years old. So the influence of the Jesuits and the influence of the kind of logical thinking that he learned at that residential school stayed with him. And in many, many of his canvases and his works on paper, we see him puzzling through, critiquing, and commenting on this notion that European thought and European systems of logic and analysis are superior to everything else on Earth. And so he tends to juxtapose European imagery with his own imagery or with historical pictures. So this is a Muybridge. This is from Muybridge's study of animals in motion. It's an elk in motion. I don't know if you're familiar with those pictures, but they were a series of early photographs of animals walking. And it was in order to understand anatomically how animals or how the mechanism of motion worked. Morrisseau takes those pictures and reproduces them. Sorry, am I fading in and out? Yeah, I shouldn't have stood up. With a picture of himself. He's talking about the way that Indigenous people were studied by anthropologists or analyzed as animals would have been, who were classified and determined, this is how much Indian you have in you, or this is where you belong, or how you were delineated in the national imagination. I love Carl Beam's work because of the combination of heart and mind that it brings. They're very tactile. they are prints mostly. These are photo emulsion prints. I'd love to see these works set beside Joan Quick-to-See Smith's prints as well, because I think her concerns are quite similar. So again, this is another really wonderful benefit of bringing this work to the Southwest, to be able to set them beside other works and have them talk together and have us talk together about them as well. So thank you again for that. This is a work by Faye Heavyshield. So Faye Heavyshield was born in 1953 on the Genaabaajing First Nation in Saskatchewan. Alberta. I beg your pardon, in Alberta. She also attended St. Mary's Residential School, a residential school on the prairie. But like Carl Beam, after leaving the residential school, she went to the Alberta College of Art in 1980. And later, she went to the University of Calgary in 1986. So here we see another example of an Indigenous artist who comes out of their tradition, has been inflected by the residential school, and then further inflected by the Western Academy, and then comes forward with this brand new way of speaking in art. So this piece is called Sisters. It was made in 1993. It's 6 pairs of shoes. So they look pretty nondescript, maybe, but if we look at them a little bit more closely, we might be able to unpack some of what Faye is talking about here. The shoes have been altered with plaster and gesso and acrylic paint. They're set in a circle, and they're pointing out. And on the tips of their toes, you'll see that the toes have been cloven. They're split in two. These are deer feet. Yeah. And, you know, of course, the circle is a really important symbol in Indigenous art. We see it on the hide paintings. We see it in the way that teepees are constructed. We see it in the stone circles, the medicine circles on the prairie. So these circle of shoes bring us all of those things to our minds. They're also a defensive position. We see these are women's shoes. They're high heels, in fact. They're standing in a circle. They've got each other's back. I don't know what else I want to say about them. There's a lot, you know, but I think that really what Faye is talking about here is strength, survival, how we support one another, just as a teepee does, how we endure, just as those stone circles, the medicine wheels on the prairie, continue to tell the story of the culture of those people.
Yeah, when you said protection, like my Inuit art brain geared always is it looks like for us, like Arctic, you have muskox, or you call them McMichael in Inuktitut, and it's kind of like a triceratops. Like you circle around and you protect elderly or young or sick people or sick muskoxen in the center of the ring, and then you've got the protection all around you. So I see that. Yeah, I don't think I had interpreted it that way until you said that, the protection.
Yeah. This is another female artist. This piece doesn't come from the prairie and doesn't come from the West Coast or Ontario. This comes from the far north, the Arctic. The artist's name is Annie Putuguk. She was born in 1969 on Cape Dorset, and she died in 2016 in Ottawa, Ontario. She comes from a family of very distinguished artists. As Emily was saying, when the hunting economy in the Arctic was broken down by the Canadian government, people were given jobs in co-ops, in artist co-ops, and many, many people found work there, paid work. And Annie descends from generations of drawers, painters, and carvers. But Annie doesn't paint in a way, or draw in a way that is consonant with the way that the government wanted the Inuit people to make their work. She began, what they wanted was nice coffee table carvings, soapstone carvings of oxen, prints of people in parkas looking into a hole with seals coming out, That's the kind of work that was being promoted and that had a market. Annie broke that mold. These are large, so this particular work is 20 by 23 inches, but some of her works are very large. And they're made out of pencil crayon, mostly. Sometimes felt tip markers, not expensive materials. But the more important thing about Annie's work isn't so much the material, it's the subject matter. She's talking about contemporary life in the Arctic as it's experienced by Inuit people in settlements. These are people who were accustomed to, until very recently, in most of our lifetimes, who were accustomed to hunting and providing for themselves, building their own homes, taking care of elders, looking after everything in their own homes, in their own way, who have now been moved into really quite crappy residences in the towns, really quite insufficient water supplies or food supplies. Most of the food now is imported. It's very rare to get country food, to get hunted food. And the food that you get in the stores has to be brought up by airplane from the south. It's extremely expensive. So poverty is a big problem up there. What Annie talks about is what kind of culture do we have now? Some of her subject matter often includes a television. Dr. Phil or Oprah will be on the TV. You can see a crate of red rose tea. The men are bringing in a seal. That's a big deal. Her work has a kind of poignancy because she's unafraid of addressing some of the social issues in her town, but it has an added poignancy because of what happened to Annie when she came south. She came to live in Ottawa, which is the capital city of Canada, and which is a place where many, many Inuit people end up when they come south. Why? Because that's where the planes land. There's a direct flight from Ottawa to Nunavut. So Annie came down to Ottawa and ended up on the street. She was plagued with alcoholism. She was plagued with domestic abuse. She was murdered, and her body was dumped in the Ottawa River. It's still a cold case. She was murdered in 2016, 8 years ago. It's still a cold case. This is really important because in Canada we have a very, very bad problem with missing and murdered Indigenous women. And Annie Putukuk, who is one of our foremost artists, suffered that fate. So I just want to shout out to her right now. That struggle is still with us to address this, the violence against Indigenous women that is everywhere among us in Canada. I don't know if it's here, but it's a huge problem.
Yeah, and I'll talk a little bit about this work as well. So very much how we were talking about Norval Morrisseau as being incredibly influential on young Anishinaabeg artists today. Annie Putugu is in the same vein. I work with a lot of emerging artists, and when asked who's your biggest influence, who do you look up to the most in the art world? Oftentimes it's Annie Pootagoo. And Annie Pootagoo was, in fact, like, despite not producing some of what the government or what, you know, Inuit print and art making has been heavily edited and heavily controlled by Southern by my standards, art professionals. And this isn't what we would typically maybe associate with some of that more romantic, these more romantic ideas. But she was the first Inuk woman to win the Sobey Award, which is the biggest art prize in Canada. I think it's something like a $100,000 prize. I don't remember what year that was, unfortunately. I should have written that down. But I really love this work because, actually, I'm going to teach you a little bit of Inuktitut today. Mamaktu, so you say mamak tu, and that's to say it's delicious. Yeah. So this would be a very big day. You're getting fresh seal, fresh nutchik in. And so I already know you see this guy's got one boot off. They're ready to process this. They're ready to take this into the kitchen. And if you've ever seen a seal get broken down, sometimes like people can do it really fast. I've seen people do it like very rapidly. It never happens on a table. It never happens on a butcher's block. It either happens outside on the snow, or better yet, bring it inside and you put it down on a piece of cardboard on the kitchen floor. And that's typically, like, oftentimes food is it's a very communal aspect for Inuit. And it's always done usually on the floor, but always on cardboard, just because if you have something like a seal, it's very iron rich and it stains and it smells really strong. You're not going to want that on your kitchen table. I'm going to say that right now. And you smell it, like, you can't hide if you've been eating seal either. Like, it comes out of your pores afterwards. But yeah, Bonnie mentioned also the red rose tea here in the corner, and so because food is getting imported, there's oftentimes repetition over and over, like what kind of products come to communities and have become really recognizable. Like, you might only be getting red rose tea. That might be your only option. A box of red rose tea nowadays might run you, I don't know if anybody knows anything about Arctic food prices. That box that size, that could easily run you $75 in the Arctic. So there is a food crisis, and there has been this massive transition in the way that Inuit eat food and we engage with food. My father grew up eating iguanak, which is like it's fermented, usually walrus. And nowadays nobody eats iguanak anymore because that was really to address the lack of refrigeration. But our food stories have changed, and now things that are more recognizable are craft dinner, red rose, red robin, spam. That is, we probably have that in common, and Robin Hood flour. And so nowadays too, like, these food histories, whether they are sort of affectionate and or if they're critical, they're still being investigated by Inuit artists. And one that is practicing this a lot right now, her name is Kalaaleq Duffy. She's an Inuit artist who does these big collages of red rose tea, spam, click, very cool Andy Warhol style pop art. But yeah, I do love this work. It's a big deal to be a provider in Inuit culture and bring home the bacon, or in this case, the nutchik, bring home the seal. Yeah.
Our next work is by Tim Pitsiulak Timote. Born in Baffin Island in 1967 and died in 2016. He studied jewelry making to begin with at the Nunavut Arctic College, but he was at the same time a hunter. And as Emily has said, being a provider is a hugely important role in these communities. And his job as a hunter probably influenced his artwork more than the jewelry making, because his work largely is about, well, he's got two kind of strains. I'm showing one strain. When you go into the gallery, you'll see the other. He's interested in animals. He's interested in the effects of hunting on animals. He's interested in the effects of global warming on animals and on hunters. And so a lot of his work has an ecological bent. This drawing is called Bowhead with Beluga Whales. It was made in 2011. Again, it's colored pencil over graphite and felt tip pen. So very, very inexpensive materials on a huge sheet of paper. This work is 49 inches by 97 inches. I hope you'll go and see it. One of the most incredible things about this particular drawing is the whale's eye. Now the whale's eye is tiny. But I urge you to go to this drawing and look in that whale's eye, because it contains worlds, universes, cosmoses. It's the wisdom of the animals. It's looking right at us. Tim was incredibly influenced by the changes that he was seeing in the Arctic. So the other strain of his work that I've mentioned that I don't have an image of here is of construction sites, big machineries. He was fascinated by these huge tractors that were coming up to the north. The drilling machines, of course, they're looking for oil. The huge fishing trawlers. And the impact that those heavy machinery and their operators were having on the economy in the north and on the land and the oceans in the north. They're beautiful drawings, carefully observed. This may be where the jewelry making comes in, is in the careful observation of these animals and of these machines. The other thing I think that is so interesting about this particular piece is the way the whale is also a landscape. Can you see? Yeah. Here's whales here. And there's a little boat of hunters. There's a mask on the top and on the side. Here are schools of fish. Here are the belugas. The whale is us. The whale is our land. Yeah. He died tragically in 2016, so he's not with us anymore. But again, one of the major contributors to telling the story of his country and his people.
Yeah, and something you've mentioned a couple times and I haven't touched on yet is about the materials that Inuit artists are using, and that word inexpensive is key. Inexpensive and also lightweight. So the reason we don't have, or Inuit don't have, we don't typically have a painting practice. There are Inuit painters now, more and more and more. Darcy Bernhardt is an example. Megan Kayakmanteith, artists are now able to access canvases. But the reason that printmaking and felt tip drawing, pencil crayon, even crayon and graphite became so popular with Inuit artists is that it was easy to get to the north. So that's why we have these colored pencil drawings, which I think it's interesting how so much of art histories is about what materials you can access, and that's changed a lot now. And the reason sculpture, you can even, with Inuit sculpture and carving, you can tell where a work is from, sometimes by its style, but also very much by what kind of stone it is. So Nunavik has really, really dark black stone. Areas around Akviat and Nunavut, you've got super hard stone, so you get really minimalist shapes because it's difficult to carve. And here, paper, pencil, crayons, those are easy to get up north. And some other interesting elements, like Bonnie, you've pointed out these masks here, and so these are a man and a woman. A male face up there, and then the woman's face there, and they're angakak masks or shaman masks. So, and you can sort of differentiate them because you can, I don't know if you can see it, maybe I would invite you, when you get a chance in the gallery, go take a close look up at that eye, but then also up at the woman's mask at the front, because she has tunit, or the facial tattoos, carved into the mask, because so that's how you're able to sort of differentiate the two. And even going back to what you were saying about potlatch ban and certain ceremonies being banned or having to sort of go covert, Inuit tattooing was one of those too. It was banned, it was made illegal. And what's really beautiful about these masks is that they look, I don't know if he was intentionally doing this, but they look very much like masks that are in the collection of the name of this institution changes all the time, but I think it's now the Canadian Museum of History, which are 3,000 years old. And I remember seeing those masks for the first time because our tattooing is just revitalizing now. I'm very proud to wear what few small ones I have and to realize that's a practice that has, it's 3,000 years old, it's 4,000 years old, 6,000 years old, it's thousands and thousands and thousands of years old, and it had a quick break, and it's coming back, but you still see it all the time, even when tattoo practice wasn't, because this is 2011, that is maybe the very, very earliest moment that tattoo practice is starting to come back with Inuit women, and to see it still depicted in art, to me, is very special and shows the resiliency. And again, that needing, like very much like Charles Eden Shaw, we need to find ways to hold on to and record and make sure that these are passed on and they're not lost. I have a friend who says, my tattoos aren't mine, they're just for me to keep for future generations. And I think that same mindset can be applied to many other art forms as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Now I'm going to switch gears. This is Kent Monkman. Kent Monkman was born in St. Mary's, Ontario in 1965, still with us, very much with us, very, very active painter. He's a member of the Serpent River First Nation, Cree. So Kent, what to say, where to start? He's a painter of monumental history paintings. He mimics those monumental history paintings from Europe that we are aware of, Delacroix and David, but with a twist, of course. He inserts himself or his alter ego into these paintings. He calls this, you probably know, I see some people, what's the name? Mischief, yes, eagle testicle, yes. So Mischief, and she's in this picture, and the way you're going to find out where she is, I'm going to show you because there's, dozens of people in this picture. But see those two figures on the pinto pony galloping in, and you see the one in the front, and you see on his foot, there's a high heel shoe. That's Mischief. So Kent, once again, breaking the rules and talking about two-spirit, transgender, homosexuality, and placing it in the history of the West. In this particular case, he's depicting a gathering of traders and trappers that was an annual kind of event. Happened in Wyoming, Idaho, and Utah. It was called, what was it called? The Rendezvous. Yes, it was called a rendezvous. And of course it was a rendezvous. It was a bacchanal. It was a huge party. It started out very sedately and with commercial intent. So the idea was you would bring your furs there and you would trade them. Well, pretty soon it became this raucous opportunity for all kinds of mischief. And of course, Kent's work, it's funny and it's important, and it's taking a poke at the academic painting. But it's also talking about things that were not really talked about, particularly with respect to Indigenous art. Now, Morisot did it earlier, and we haven't really talked about Morisot's work around this notion of two-spirit. But this is a undercurrent. Kent brings it right to the surface. He's absolutely unabashedly celebrating the fact that in Indigenous culture, before the imposition of Catholicism and the kind of normative, heteronormative, binary idea that there's a man and there's a woman and that's it. And you're one or the other. What Kent is positing, what Norval Morrisseau posited before him, is that in Indigenous communities, there was much more fluidity in the genders. A woman could be a warrior. A man could dress in women's clothes and weave baskets. There could be weddings between men and men. This is just part of our history. And it, of course, was obliterated. We're talking about pulling the culture through the eye of a needle. Well, Kent, in all of his crazy, explosive frivolity, is doing the same thing. He's talking about a culture that was severely threatened and almost obliterated, but continues to survive. So this work is monumental. It's 72 inches by 120 inches. It was made in 2017. It's called Wedding at Sodom. There are biblical references all through this. I mean, we could spend a lot of time talking about the various images that are apparent and what he's trying to get across to us. But I think one of the most poignant images here is this one. We see, and it's, I believe, the only female depicted in this picture, and she's being carried off on a blanket. He's commenting again, of course, on some of the collateral damage that would have occurred in this extremely male-dominated situation. He's talking about the diseases that were prevalent, that would have been brought to communities because of the trade. And of course, he's also talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women.
I think, again, with the symbolism, you could go into this forever, and there's a lot, too, that talks about those trade relationships, like the Métis sash, which is sort of a garment that was developed by Métis people, who were people that came about as a product of French traders and Indigenous people meeting. And then even, I don't know if this was intentional, but we see those red toques. And to me, it made me it's like habitant toques, which were French traders. But I think one of the really beautiful things about Kent's work is that these are always real people. He uses real people, and and there's not quite the same amount of Indigenous people depicted in this work that he does, but normally when he's painting, he paints these massive monumental works. He uses, or he works with models who are members of the Indigenous community, often around Toronto where his studio is. And being from and living in Toronto myself, it's very exciting because sometimes you'll go into work of Kent's show and be like, is that Brianna? Like, you're just sneaking a little bit closer, and it is, and it's people that you know, which is always really exciting. And again, it's that it is showing that we're still here, we're still a part of the world, they're not fictitious people at all. He's always painting, and very intentionally and very as true to life as possible, he's painting real people from his circles and his communities.
Yeah, and I'll just add another thing to that because it is crucial to his practice. Kent is, so the practice of using live models and recognizable figures from the community in his work goes right back to Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel. You know, those were often caricatures of real people. But more than that, Kent has also established a studio, and he has a group of artists who work with him. And so a lot of this painting will not have been painted by Kent himself. It will have been painted by a studio, a group of artists, a stable of artists that he employs to finish these paintings. And again, he is riffing off of the studio of Rembrandt, who had many, many apprentices and acolytes who would have worked on those pictures. Kent has taken a lot of criticism because of this practice of having a large stable of painters. But this is a tradition in art, and it's a really interesting trajectory into Western art history to see an Indigenous artist taking those liberties, taking those steps, and still maintaining the narrative focus of his work. I think we have to move along because we're getting late, and we're yakking too much. So, yeah, if you have to leave, it's okay, but we'll carry on, okay? This piece is by Dana Claxton. So Dana Claxton is Hunkpapa Lakota. She's from the Wood Mountain Lakota First Nation in Saskatchewan. So she's part of the people who went across the border seeking asylum in Canada from Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull's people. And a portion of that group of people stayed in Canada, and those are her family members. So Dana was born in Yorkton, Saskatchewan in 1959. She, as well, is still with us, thank goodness. This piece is called Headdress, Sade, and it was made in 2019. It's a photograph. So what Dana did was she invited a model to come in, and she asked the model to bring every piece of Indigenous jewelry or finery that she owned. And at first the idea was, well, we'll just find the most beautiful ones and we'll kind of, edit through. And in the end, they decided to put everything on. So she put every single bit of jewelry on, including the beaded baseball caps on the top, the West Coast basket cap that's underneath that, and the feather breast piece. I think what's really interesting, there's a couple of really interesting things about this piece. What inspired this work was a moment in Dana's life. She's a teacher. She teaches at the university. She's a university professor. She's the head of fine art at UBC in Vancouver. So she's an academic. She's at an academic conference, and they're standing in line waiting for lunch. You had to go with your tray, and they give you lunch. So she's with PhD candidates. She's with other scholars. She's with visiting artists. None of them are Indigenous. She's the only Indigenous person in the line. And one of the academics in the lineup for food came up to her and said, "Oh, you've got a beautiful necklace on." And she had a piece of turquoise. But there were other chains that were in her blouse. And the woman reached into her blouse and pulled out her jewelry because she wanted to look at it. So Dana said, I would never touch someone or touch their pearls, even how beautiful they are, and pull them out of your clothing to look at them. And so she said to the model and to the viewer, "You want to see Indigenous jewelry?" Here it is. The other thing about this piece, and I'll try and make it quick because I know we're running over time now, but this piece is a large cybochromatic print. It's a photograph that is printed on a transparency and put into a light box. But Dana doesn't call it a light box. She calls it a fire box. Light boxes were invented in BC by let's see, I have it written down here and I really need to say this. So there was a Vancouver school of conceptual photography that was founded in the late 80s and the 1990s. It was a boys' club. Members of that, a very, very influential group of male photographers, including Jeff Wall and Rodney Graham and others, really made a name for themselves, making these large transparencies shown in light boxes. And this is Dana's response to that. She puts these pictures of women, it's as part of a series of pictures of women in something called fireboxes. So reclaiming and kind of spitting in the face, I guess, of the contemporary art world. Dana Claxton. Okay, I'll go on. This piece is by Nadia Meyer. Nadia Meyer was born in 1974 in Montreal. She's an Algonquin member of the Kitikin-Zibi First Nation in Ontario. These are called scar paintings. It's a series. There are hundreds, literally hundreds of them. This is number 8. It was made in 2006. It's acrylic over stitching on canvas. This picture was not made by Nadia Meyer. This picture was made, it was a group of people that collaborated. They all got together. The project went from 2006 to 2013, and I hear that it is still ongoing. There were almost 500 participants. They were asked to describe their hurt. So each participant described their hurt, and then the second half was describe your healing. And so they sewed them up. There are also, each piece is accompanied by a short written account of what happened. How did you get hurt? And how did you get healed? The participants were from all age groups. They were from all genders. They were from all races. What can I say? Just beautiful, beautiful work. Nadia Meyer. This is the last piece I'm going to talk about. This is Ruth Cuthand. Ruth Cuthand was born in 1954 in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. She is Plains Cree and Scottish. She has an MFA from the University of Saskatchewan, so again, academy trained. She specialized in painting and drawing, and later on in her career in beadwork. She was teaching a course at the University of Saskatchewan, a First Nations university in Saskatoon, and was asked to teach a course in Indigenous or Indian materials. This was back in 2006. And she didn't know anything about, an urban person, right? An urban Indigenous person who really didn't feel like she could pretend to know anything about Indigenous materials. What she did know was beads. Beading is, universal, but for Indigenous people, it's incredibly important. Beads used to be made of porcupine quills, or they would be made of little bits of shell. There's a huge tradition of bead making right across Turtle Island, right across North America. But what Ruth was interested in was glass beads, because glass beads represent the coming of the Europeans. They were far more beautiful than any kind of homemade dyed porcupine quills. They shone and they glittered, and they were traded freely. They were available. So she decided that she would do this course in Indigenous or Indian materials. She would teach her students how to bead. And she decided that the best way to teach them how to bead was to have them bead paintings. So they would print out images of paintings on just copy paper, and they would bead those paintings. And they were so beautiful that, like Ruth just kind of decided this is what she wanted to do, was to continue to bead existing images. But something happened. She was thinking about this notion of trade and she was thinking about how great it was that we had all these things, iron pots, you know, blankets, all kinds of stuff, beads. But trade brought other things too. Trade brought disease. Her first piece that she made that was based on disease is called smallpox. She found an image of smallpox bacillum. It's a bacteria. And she found an image of that that was taken under a microscope, and she blew it up, and she printed it off, and she beaded it. And people looked at it, you know, she put them on these black velvet mountings. It's kind of a suede. And people saw it in the gallery, and oh my God, it's so beautiful. It glistened. It was lovely. They go up to it, and then they see the title. Yuck, smallpox. But this was the turning point in Ruth Cuthand's career. She became known for this incredibly poignant approach to both the tradition of beading and what beads brought with them. So this is tuberculosis. It was made in 2011. It's 25 inches by 19 inches. It's in the gallery. It's part of a series. There's a whole series of children's diseases: measles, diphtheria, whooping cough, tuberculosis, of course. All of them deadly to Indigenous people when they first arrived here. She's now making works about COVID, of course, and so beside this piece in the gallery, you'll see a COVID mask with the virus sitting on it. And what Ruth is really, really interested in is, how does this thing look? Like, what does it look like? It reminds me of Tim Pitsiolak's big whale. Instead of the big whale, it's the little tiny virus that she's looking at. Life in all of its beauty and all of its terror, eh? That's it for today. I'd really like to... Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to thank you, of course, for this incredible warm welcome, but it would be very remiss for us not to thank the Museum of Albuquerque for what they have done in putting this together and in hosting this exhibition. Andrew Connors, who's the director here, thank you so much. Josie Lopez, who's the curator here, just amazing. Yeah, thank you so much. William Gassaway, who's the curator here as well. So much information. Thank you, William. And finally, Elizabeth Becker, who is the director of education here at the gallery, organized this. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.